In 1983, the last time I was on stage in Toronto before doing playing Shylock there last year. I hadn't been in the same theater that I did playing Shylock in last year. That theater was when I helped found with the director of Playing Shylock, Martin Kinch, when he was in his late 20s and I was in my early 20s. We started a theater called Toronto Free Theater, and by 1983 it was called Canadian Stage Theater, and that was the last time I was on stage doing a play. Yeah.
Oh, before playing Shylock?
Well, in Toronto. Right after that, Des McAnuff is an old friend of mine from Toronto that I'd worked with in New York in the late 70s when he was here. He was artistic director. You know who Des is, the director
Yep.
of Tommy and all that, and Jersey Boys. So I'd known him since he was 18 years old. And he gave me my first job in New York in the late 70s in a play at the Public Theater. And then in 1984, I think it was, he asked me to come to La Jolla, which is and do Touchstone. So you like it? And when he did it, I kind of did an S.J. Perlman kind of sophisticated Jewish comic version of it, going into the Forest of Arden with Louis Vuitton luggage. And so anyway, yeah.
So you were a child actor because your father was in theater. Is that correct?
No, that's not the reason, but it is one of the reasons. I was a child actor because I was violent, and I grew up. I grew up in a immigrant. I grew up in a immigrant Jewish working class French Canadian neighborhood filled with anti-Semitic French Canadians and French hating, Catholic hating Jews. And I was a little kid, and there were gangs, and the the job of kids who were 5 or 6 on the street was to arm the older kids with stones. And my mother and father were my father was working in a factory because he didn't speak English, and my mother was we were in one room, you know, and my mom was sewing clothes or whatever to make a living. And if I came home bleeding once, I remember she just turned me right around, cleaned me up, and said, God gave you 2 fists to go fight with. So grew up in a violent world. We moved from Montreal to Ottawa, and I didn't speak English. I spoke Yiddish and French, which Friddish. Now I spoke street French, which is the word is joie. I spoke a dialect and Yiddish. By the time I was 5, I was picking up English. And when we moved, my dad got a better job in Ottawa. Now, Ottawa, for the first time, I'm now in a regular public school. And man, I was violent. And so it was free in 1957 to, or whatever it was, to send your little boy to children's theater school because you were called queer or faggot or whatever if you were a boy. Girls, they had to pay for it. There were 1,000 girls and no boys. So it was free. So they sent me there, partly because my father loved theater, yes, but mostly to how to channel my violence that I'd grown up with. I was ready for a fight. And I think a favorite thing that I say is I went there and I never left there. I was taught there were 2 British women whose husbands were part of the Royal British High Commission. It was Ottawa, the capital of the country. And they were kind of bored. And so they were both Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts graduates. And they taught children the art of the drama. And I fell in love with it. And I really never left there. And I've never had a job, in my life. I've only ever done theater from the age of 7. I started not so much because my father, like all immigrant parents, no matter what nationality, they want you to go to college. They want you to have yes, maybe you're an artist if you're insane, but you want to have something to fall back on. You're not going to be a writer or director or painter or dancer, um, whatever, fine, but go to get a degree, which I never did. I said, if I have something to fall back on, I'm going to fall back on it. So I need the tightrope. I need to have no net. And so I did try college a bit, but I knew what I wanted to do from the age of 7. So I did that. That's all I've ever done.
We should back up. We should introduce you to our
Yeah.
listeners. So, listeners, if the voice you're hearing is familiar to you, the voice belongs to Saul Rubinek. His bio is available on our website, and it is extensive and impressive. And I have to say, it's very, very fun to talk to you because you're such a familiar presence in film and television. I'll just dive in with a question. Your show that you're starring in right now, you're playing in the one-person show
Written by Mark Lear and Young.
not by you.
Nope,
But am I correct in saying that you've added some personal writing to it?
not really. Mark and the director, Martin Kinch, and I were stuck at home like everybody else was in 2020, disinfecting, groceries, bored out of our minds, right? He had this concept earlier in an earlier version of this play, but it wasn't the same. And I said, well, what if I'm playing a version of myself? So the premise of the play is that a production of Merchant of Venice has been canceled. And at intermission, the actors and the crew and everybody else, including me, my character plays Shylock, find out at intermission on their phones a press release canceling the run that was sent early. It was an embargoed press release. It wasn't supposed to come out until tomorrow, but for some reason it was released early. And so my character refuses to do the second act. So I welcome the audience as if the audience is coming back from intermission for Merchant of Venice. So the audience becomes a character right away. I come out in this Hasidic Orthodox dress and I explain there's not going to be a second part. It's my fault. I refuse to do it. And I say, listen, our run has been canceled. And I'm furious. And now one of the things that we came up with was that my character, the character of the actor who's playing Shylock, his name should be Saul Rubinek, a child of Holocaust survivors. Why would a child of Holocaust survivors do an anti-Semitic play? Because obviously the play has been canceled because of this time of rising anti-Semitism. And the character of Shylock is historically caused a lightning rod for a lot of controversy. Is this an anti-Semitic character? Is it a portrayal of a bad guy who's a Jew? Should this be allowed today? And it's been controversial for quite a long time. And my character defends the play and the character in a number of interesting ways. I'm going to anticipate a couple of your questions here. And one of the things is that the character says, look, this is the first three-dimensional Jewish character in the history, not only of English literature, but of all literature. He explains that in 1595, when this play was written, there had been no Jews in England for 300 years. You couldn't use the word anti-Semitic. It is a word that was invented much later and would have been meaningless to an audience then. There were Jewish characters portrayed, even though there had been no Jews, but they were devils with horns, puppets in a religious pageant. Or in the case of most recently, 5 years before Merchant of Venice was written, in 1590, Christopher Marlowe had written The Jew of Malta, which was one of the very first times that a human being actually played the character of a Jew. And that character was so unmitigatedly evil that it's almost never done today. Although the rest of the characters, Christians included, are all evil and horrible people. But the central character of the Jew, Barabbas, is really bad. And he burns in a pit of hellfire. But nobody had seen Jews on the streets, ever. Now, Shylock is a bad guy, I can explain why. But his motives for what he does are certainly clearer than any motives that have been ascribed or you can possibly ascribe to Iago in Othello. His motives are very clear. He is reviled, he's spit on in public squares, he's a character who has famous speeches about how he's just as human as everybody else. You have to imagine that the only way you can really imagine the effect on audiences in the 16th century, guys, they threw shit. They threw figs and they threw oyster shells at villains, and they booed them, and they were 99% illiterate. And they loved bad guys, and they booed them and hissed them. And they were very often, a Jew character would only be played by the comic actor like a Will Kemp in the company, certainly not by the stars of the company. So people would throw shit at them. You have to imagine. I'm going to take you back to, you're an audience member in 1595, and you're at the Globe Theater, and an actor comes on stage in a red wig, which was called a Judas wig. Jews were red. They had a nose. He would have had a nose, a fake nose that would be hooked right down to his chin. And they would have had their hands ready to throw shit, right? Except that the actor playing the role, they would have recognized him. Why? Because his name was Richard Burbage and he owned the fucking theater. And he was 30 years old and he was the star. In fact, he had just finished playing Richard III and he was a massive star. Okay. Why is the half owner of the theater not only playing the Jew part, the comic part, the villain part, but why is he doing a 5-scene role? Why isn't he playing the title role, the merchant of Venice, who's a Christian called Antonio? Why is he doing this part? Well, that is a question that is particularly interesting. It begs who wrote it. It begs why do it? Because, as my character explains, if you were in the 16th century where there had been no Jews on the streets for 300 years and all you'd seen is devils with horns, and suddenly an actor playing the Jew comes on and he's just asking, what are the terms? How long do you want to make the loan for? Or what's the collateral? Those are his lines. And then he's castigated for charging interest. Because in Venice in 16th century, Jews had very few options for what they were allowed to do legally. One of them was to lend money, and one of them was to lend money at interest, which Christians were barred from doing. So, and they're reviled for it. They need the money, but they're reviled for a Jew making a living that way. So they're spit on for it. So this particular character says, okay, no interest. You want to spit on me for interest? Fine. Then what'll the collateral be? Now the money is being borrowed by the richest guy in town. Why? Because his buddy needs money to court this woman, Portia. He wants to marry her. And you need money to court this rich woman. You need courtiers, you need clothes. But Antonio can't lend his buddy money because all of his money is tied up in 5 different ships that are out. He hasn't got cash. He's got no liquid cash. So Antonio says, okay, we'll go to the Jew. We'll borrow what you need from him. And my collateral will be my reputation. I'm the richest guy in town. And Shylock says, okay, I'm not going to, you hate me for charging interest. I won't charge interest. You're the richest guy in town. You know, Shylock doesn't even know he's got 5 ships out with all this money tied up, but apparently he must have some reason for borrowing money. So we'll make a joke and I don't know. If you default, which is impossible, I'll get a pound of flesh, which they laugh about. A pound of flesh, meaning it says, I'll take your life, which he's got another reason for. Not that he thinks he'll ever do that, but it's a way of saying fuck you to Antonio, who treats him like shit and always has. And all his people like shit. You've never seen that on a British stage. Ever. You haven't seen that on a European stage. You haven't seen that on any stage anywhere, ever, until 1595. Now, what happens? First, eventually Shylock's only child, his daughter, steals his dead wife's jewelry and runs off with some Christian good-for-nothing. And that's when Shylock, now crazed with grief about his daughter, finds out this Jew-hating son of a bitch is defaulting on the fucking loan. Oh, now Shylock really wants his pound of flesh. And they try to talk him out of it. They even offer him, well, his buddy's now married Portia, who's pretending to be the judge at this goddamn trial. And they even offer him 3 times the 3,000 ducats. But the loan is by law already defaulted. He has a right to his pound of flesh. Well, they trick him. They say you can take your pound of flesh. You're not allowed to take any blood, though. If you do that, we'll kill you. And if you want to save your life, then, since you've been threatening the life of a Christian and you're an alien, your life is defaulted. And if you want to beg mercy of the court, then you've got to become a Christian. Now, this is the bad guy. Obviously a complex character. Not only a complex character, You got to remember this character is the subplot. He's in 5 scenes in this play. That's it. 5 scenes. Question: why has a 5-scene role, why, made the reputation of actors for 400 years? Macklin, Booth, Keane, Irving, Gielgud, Olivier, among others. None of them Jews, but nobody's perfect. They say why? Well, it's to just simply say this is an anti-Semitic character is absurd, especially since the word anti-Semitism couldn't have existed when it was written. Also, to say a guy called Shakespeare, who was a grain merchant who'd never left England and hadn't seen a Jew in his life, wrote this is tacitly absurd. Certainly debatable. Certainly not heresy to say someone else wrote it, as the Shakespeare industrial complex would have you believe that it's heresy to say so. This is a play, among many others, that couldn't have been written by this mostly uneducated son of a Glover, who is it is more than likely, and I'm not alone, more than likely, although not definitively, probably written by the Earl of Oxford. All of these plays by Edward de Vere, who was probably the most highly educated man of his era and who grew up with the best library in Europe, grew up with theater. His father owned and operated and sponsored theaters, was a half owner of the Globe Theater, and who lived in Venice when he was 25, right beside the Jewish ghetto, knew the man Shylock was based on, Gaspar Ribeiro, and saw with his own eyes what anti-Semitism looked like when there were real Jews on the streets to attack. You can't write this character. And it's not about snobbery. You have to be an Earl of Oxford or upper class to be imagined. Of course, anybody, any commoner can write anything brilliant. A commoner could be Mozart, even though Mozart wasn't a commoner. But you have to grow up with a father who could have the wherewithal to train you in music. If you were born with the genius of Mozart and you were a peasant, you weren't going to become Mozart. You needed an education in order for your genius to flower. And in this case, I make a case for it. Why? Because it matters who wrote it. Here I am doing a one-man show for you guys. You're not going to get a question in edgewise. So this is interesting. Let me ask you: does it matter you're listening to the Ninth Symphony? You go to the Ninth Symphony, Jim Garrett. Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you need to know that it was written by Beethoven?
No. So
wait. Let me ask you seriously. Right. I'm asking you the question.
No, it doesn't.
I really want to know. Well, it does, man. And I'll tell you why it matters. Okay. Because Beethoven was deaf when he wrote it. And because the people that are interpreting it for you know that. And the conductor who's interpreting the music and helping to train, to guide all these musicians. And you don't need to know anything about Edvard Munch's The Cry when you look at it. No, you really don't. But actually, if you do, and if you know where it comes from and who created it, it is going to give you a deeper understanding of the art that you're looking at, listening to, or watching. You simply will. And this age that we're living in now, where an artist's biography is far more important than the art, it matters. And it matters in a case where a show has been censored and closed down.
That's
who
fair.
wrote it?
My question is, if Edward de Vere did write Shakespeare's plays, or the plays that we are talking about, and I went to see them, how would my knowledge of Edward de Vere writing it versus Shakespeare writing it change my experience of the play? I think that's the point you're trying to make.
It doesn't necessarily, unless you found out about the background of the writer. What is? I mean, there are many different ways to appreciate art. Mm-hmm. of any sort, paintings and opera and dance and music and novels. I mean, you don't really need to know about Mark Twain's life, although, if you're going to read Huckleberry Finn and it's got the N-word all over it, you better teach it with some context. It took Maya Angelou a long time to think it was a great novel. And it's very important to understand where he comes from in the antebellum South, to understand why he wrote the only decent adult human being in the book who's a male is Jim. It is important. if you want it to be important, it deepens your understanding of all art to be educated. If you're not educated in it and you say, well, I know what I like, that's valid. It's simplistic, but it's valid. And certainly it's valid. I mean, art can affect you. But I would say that somebody looking at non-objective art, modern art, would say my kid can do that is with finger painting. When you're looking at some of the great non-objective artists of all time, and it helps to be educated to understand why this is important art, what makes it important. I think that it matters that it's debatable who wrote the play, not that you fall on one side or another. It matters that the greatest living Shakespeare actor of our time, Mark Rylance, absolutely is doubts that this was written by a guy from Stratford. It matters. And it matters why. And it matters that they took the image of him in Stratford, where he had barley in his statue, and in the 18th century took out the barley and put a pen and quill in his hand.
A quill.
It matters. It matters that got changed. It matters that all hyphenated names in the era were pseudonyms. It matters that Edward de Vere, if he were outed as a playwright at the time, would have been canceled as an earl, as well as his entire family. It matters why it might have been secret at the time and why it would have been shameful and sinful. And it matters that probably they all knew who it was. It matters that the word Shakespeare is a pseudonym for jerking off, shaking a spear at the time. I have that feeling that the Elizabethans, if they heard what happened now, that this pseudonym for jerking off, shake a spear, that this became the most famous writer in the world, they would laugh their fucking asses off. Yeah. Anyway, this all matters because it's funny, it's interesting, it's ironic, but it also gives you a deeper appreciation to the times, because really all that matters is the discussion of humanity that this playwright was able to talk about, sometimes well, not always well. I don't think Merchant of Venice is all that great, except for those 5 scenes.
Yeah, I know, and I guess that was my question, is like how, obviously if I'm an audience member and I have a deep knowledge of Edward de Vere and the time of Elizabethan England and all of that stuff, it's going to impact differently. But 95% of the people who go see Shakespeare or watch it on film have no idea. They just know this is Shakespeare.
Man. I didn't know. I had, during COVID, I met somebody called Roger Strittmatter, who wrote a very important work about De Vere's Bible, that everything that's underlined in there, 95% of it is actually ends up in the work of so-called Shakespeare. And I met Roger, talked to Roger. Then I did my own deep dive. Then I read about De Vere, but I'd grown up thinking this was a conspiracy theater by nutballs, thinking that it wasn't Shakespeare. And then I found out, no, it's a valid. There are PhDs in authorship all over the world, whether it's Rembrandt or this, or you can make, but only when it comes to Shakespeare is it like saying there's no God. Is it heresy? Only when it comes to that, apparently this obviously debatable question that's got both sides have got things to say. This just discussing it is considered heresy or ridiculous or not worth talking about. And I'm saying to you that your question, I'm answering it many different ways. The more you know, the more you appreciate anything,
right,
including art.
And I do agree that there is a Shakespeare. I think that's the only thing that would be hurt if we were to finally say Edward de Vere wrote it, is the Shakespeare industrial complex would, and particularly Stratford upon Avon, would suffer an economic hit. But I don't think
I cried borscht.
It wouldn't change the world. It wouldn't change the words, and it wouldn't change the performance.
Yeah, it does.
Of the
you know what it does? It does change the performance of the play, because it does change everything. When you know the history of classical music and who Beethoven was influenced by, when you understand the influences of a composer or a painter, your appreciation of two-dimensional art, of all the Christ stuff that happened before depth was created, you don't understand it. You look at this art and you go to Florence and you look at this two-dimensional art and you go, I think paintings, got better. What the fuck was their problem? Unless you contextualize the art that you're looking at, unless you understand what a cave painting was and what it could have possibly have been like. You want me to give you an example?
Sure.
You want to do what? Let me just get this straight. What do you want to do? You're going to I want to show, when we hunted the mammoth yesterday, and, my brother and your sister, a bunch of people were killed, but we got the mammoth. You want to put this where? Here, where we eat? Yeah, I'm going to put this on the wall. Are you out of your fucking mind? You're going to show this mammoth hunt where our people died here on the wall, on this cave wall. Yeah, not a chance. And I guarantee you this argument happened. And after they eventually agreed to let him, at a certain point, whoever fucking did it, they said, "What are you doing now?" I'm putting, what's that? It's my handprint. Why? Well, I'm going to sign it. The fuck? Then wait, now you want to do what? You're going to tell this story where? In front of the fire while we eat. You're going to act it all out while we eat. I suppose you want to get paid for this. Well, I wouldn't mind some food that since I'm not eating with you. Fuck you. And I would imagine that the first artists who ever did this had these problems. Okay. And these problems, I'm not kidding. I know it sounds like a Saturday Night Live sketch, but I guarantee that it was not a piece of fucking cake for these guys to perform these things in front of a fire, in front of their tribe, or to put it on a cave. And unless you understand something about what happened to humanity, it's just a piece of prehistory, and you're looking at a cave drawing, and that's pretty cool that they found it and they're doing it. But what went into that? What went into actually coming up with the idea of creating that as an important artifact in the history of your tribe? And why put it on a cave wall? Why tell it? Why tell it? First actors. Why tell it? Play the mammoth and the hunters. Why play it in front of your tribe, in front of the fire? Why? You know, the more you know about that, the deeper your appreciation of what it became by the time, you know, you're watching a Matrix movie.
Well, you bring up a great question. Why play it? Do you still want to play Shylock?
I never wanted to play Shylock. My character in the play wants to play Shylock. But the reason that my character in the play wants to play Shylock is because the writer, Mark Llewellyn Young, came up with this extraordinary idea based on my own background and his research into my background, that since my father was in Yiddish theater, what if my father always wanted to play Shylock? And what if I'm doing it in order to play my father playing Shylock with his accent, with his Orthodox clothing that his family wore before he broke away to do theater? What if that is the reason that the character Saul is agreed to do Merchant of Venice, and why the director, who never liked to play that much, has agreed to do it and direct Merchant of Venice? And one of the reasons he's so upset that it's been canceled is the fact that it's moving to him and frustrating and poignant, and people identify with this. I'm doing this because my father never had the chance. I'm playing my father playing Shylock because Hitler stopped him from doing Yiddish theater. And now I'm being accused of being too Jewish for Shylock. I'm being accused because one of the things I say in the play is the director of Merchant of Venice in the modern age has to figure out a way to make literature's most infamous Jew as inoffensive to Jews as possible, usually by making sure the character of Shylock is not presented as Jewish. So Shylock, so the word Jew becomes a metaphor for whatever other is currently the most oppressed in whatever community is staging it. There are productions of Shakespeare of this play by whoever, Merchant of Venice, where the character of Shylock is Black, indigenous, Palestinian, but Jewish. Oh, how positively retro! How post-Holocaust How about post-Holocaust 20th century? And so it's okay to present him in a metaphor. Presenting him not only as Jewish, but being casting a Jew and playing him as a Jew, wearing what I'm wearing, is forced a reaction from the Jewish community on the theater or whoever, and forced the theater to cancel the production in a time of rising anti-Semitism. Which my characters, that's the issue.
So what's interesting to me is that the story of the caveman and the art on the wall that you described is a little bit about cancel culture, and there is a very big stream in the play Playing Shylock about cancel culture, obviously because of the plot of the piece, but also about playing roles that you should only play, and all of that kind of stuff. I think there's a link between that. And
yes,
what do you think? I mean, I think I have so many questions for you, but let's start with, why is that happening? Like, what is the story with the canceling?
It's never not happened. It's never not happened. We didn't call it cancel culture. It's never not happened. It's happened throughout history, through any art, always, ever, forever. Since art was invented, there's always been somebody who says, don't show that, don't do that. You may not, you cannot, you shall not, you will not. Forever. So this is not new. And sometimes it's against the law, and rightly so. Rightly so. Why do I say that? Am I for censorship? Well, if I go on stage and I say, no, this is a play that's hoping, that is inciting you to go buy guns and shoot these particular people, that's called against the law. That's inciting violence. And there's a law against that. Yes, that should be censored. Okay. Yes, if I'm saying this is a play about the fact that you should, be have sex with children or whatever, something against the law. These are their reasons that we protect society. But other than the things that are against the law, no, I don't believe there should be censorship, but there always has been, especially in authoritarian cultures. They use it for their own means, and they figure it out. The statement that I read and there's self-censorship. Before you get a chance to cancel me, I'll cancel myself. That's happening everywhere. Mm-hmm. And it's certainly the statement that I read from the theater and the play are taken from real statements of Canadian theaters that canceled shows based on the fear of controversy and demonstrations. So I don't know if this is answering your question, but it is certainly, our intent was not to create a show about cancel culture, but it was to go deeper and than that, and to try to find a way into what the responsibility and the relationship, social responsibilities are in a community for art and its audience, and to try to show that dilemma beyond just saying cancel culture is full of shit. Then it's a 4-line play.
You touch on a different but related form of censorship in your show. So let me ask it this way: does Saul Rubinek have a type?
Well, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I say in the show, it's a laugh line. He says, my director, I say, you know what Martin Kinch, my director, says? He says, Saul, the minute they cast you the character, no matter what he is a Jew. And then I say, when I was very young, I played a couple of gay parts because my gay actor friends wouldn't touch them in case somebody thought they weren't acting. And I can't help thinking how close we are to that working in reverse. I mean, I'm happy that my queer friends are no longer afraid to play queer parts, but how close are we to a world where that's all they get to play? And then I talk about Jew-faced. Jew-faced is a real term that happened in London a number of years ago, where there was a British musical about Jews, and it was a big hit. And the only Jews associated with that show were the agents. And the British actors took notice, and they wrote a letter to the press, and were upset about this. They called, Jew-face, which is non-Jews playing Jews, and my character has no problem with it, because I have a problem with blackface because it's offensive and racist because of the history of what happened. I mean, I don't know if you're aware that, in the early 20th century, black actors had to wear blackface themselves in order to be acceptable, because it was a minstrel-like thing that white audiences would accept. Even a black actor, a famous black actor who was on Broadway, had to put blackface on to play a black character. And so a white actor putting blackface on is, of course, racially offensive. And rightly, we have a reaction to it. Do I have a reaction to Rachel Brosnahan playing Mrs. Maisel or Helen Mirren playing Golda Meir? Yeah, they were really good in the role. And what I really believe is what I say in the play, is that acting is appropriation, and acting who you are not is how we show our common humanity.
I couldn't agree more. And I tell my students, if you follow the logic of I'm gay, so I can only play gay parts, or you're not gay, so you can't play gay parts. If you follow the logic, then the only part you can play is yourself.
That's absurd.
And that's not interesting, right? And then Hamilton can't happen. Hamilton can't happen. So I think this whole thing, which I think is related to cancel culture on some level.
It's related to cancel culture, specifically about appropriation. And there are areas of appropriation where it is offensive. Look, we're in a history where 90% of the time, people of color were not getting a chance at roles.
Right.
The pendulum started to swing within the last 10 years, and to a very small degree, diversity and inclusion were not bad words the way they are today, and diversity, more people of color, and more women were being paid what equivalent of men, and all these things started to happen in a very small degree. We haven't really made huge inroads in people of color getting the same opportunities as white people, and but it started to change, and that's a wonderful thing, but it's not nearly happening enough. However, within that, if the world were all different, if intermarriage became so common that the most common thing was we're all some light colored skin, everybody, then blackface, Jewface, all these things become meaningless. But yes, there is a dividing line, of course, where appropriation is offensive. It isn't to me when it comes to Jewish characters, but I can understand why Jewish actors might be upset about it if there's no one in the cast at all. You'd want some Jewish presence, at least creatively, in a show about Jews. But if you're going to do a play called The Lehman Brothers, and there's no Jews in the cast, although there were in the original production Jews in the cast, but it's not written by a Jew. But it's written, if you want to look at why it was written by an Italian Catholic, because of his relationship to his father and his father's relationship to a Jewish man who had a profound effect on this playwright's life and why he wrote about it, then you'll see there is a relationship there that matters. It matters to tell you again why and who
earlier
wrote
point,
it,
yeah.
who wrote it, and why it matters.
There's a speech that you selected to share with us today. I'd be delighted if you could read it for us.
If it will feed nothing else, oh, it will feed my revenge. He hath disgraced and hindered me, half a million, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, fooled my friends, and heated mine enemies. And what is his reason? I'm a Jew. Hath not the Jew eyes? Hath not the Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed by the same food, hurt by the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same summers and winters as a Christian. If you prick us, do we not bleed? You tickle us, do we not laugh? Poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, oh, we will resemble you in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Yeah, revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, well, what should his sufferance be? By Christian example. Yeah, revenge. The villainy that you teach me, I will execute. And it will go hard, but I will better the instruction.
Thank you. That was Act 3, Scene 1 of Merchant of Venice and the character of Shylock for our listeners. Saul, one of the things that struck me about the performance and about the speech is how it made me think about Emilia's speech in Othello, which starts with, I think it is their husband's fault if wives do fail. And she goes on to spin a tale about how the sins that the women do, they learn from the men. And this is very similar. Shylock's making a very similar point, which is the sins I am committing, I've learned from you. And so what do you think Shakespeare is all about here, or De Vere is all about here, or the playwright is all about here?
Two things. I think the playwright already assumed that the Jew is human, because probably there isn't an issue of whether Jews are human. But the speech is not only, it goes in two profound directions. One is a declaration of their common humanity with Christians. but it's also a justification for revenge. I mean, if you think about it, there's a 400-year-old line that talks about Hamas, Netanyahu, Protestants, Catholics, Croatians, Serbians, you name it. The villainy that you teach me, I will execute, and it will go hard, but I will better your instruction. In other words, whatever you do to me, I'm going to do tenfold back at you. You see that 400 years ago, it anticipated the violence and the cycle of violence and revenge that happens in any age to any people. It anticipates it. And it certainly was happening there at the time between Catholics and Protestants, right? And without getting into trouble by talking about Catholics and Protestants, he's talking about Jews and Christians, right? And but it's a very universal line. The villainy you teach me, I will execute, and it will go hard, but I will better your instruction. This is very interesting. There's so the playwright is getting at something that in another piece that is never published, but it's about Thomas More, where Thomas More goes, into a marketplace, and it's attributed to the same writer who wrote these plays. That this must have been written by the same writer. Is that More in a marketplace, and you can find it. He basically says to the rabble, "Look at the way you're treating immigrants. Do you know this speech? Oh my God,
No.
guys, you need to know this speech." Let me just find it here. So this speech, here, in a series of speeches written by either Shakespeare or whoever, Thomas More makes the argument for the humane treatment of those forced to seek asylum, by being expelled from their homeland. And it's written into this play about Thomas More. "Grant them removed, and grant that this your noise hath chid down all the majesty of England." Imagine that you see the wretched strangers, their babies at their backs, and their poor luggage plodding to the ports and coasts for transportation, and that you sit as kings in your desires, authority quite silent by your brawl, and you in ruff of your opinions clothed. What had you got? I'll tell you. You had taught how insolence and strong hand should prevail, how orders should be quelled, and by this pattern not one of you should live an aged man, for other ruffians, as their fancies wrought, with self-same hands, self-reasons, and self-right, would shark on you, and men like ravenous fishes would feed on one another. Say, now the king should so much come too short of your great trespass, but to banish you. Whither would you go? What country by the nature of your error should give you harbor? You go to France or Flanders, to any German province, to Spain, to Portugal, nay, anywhere that not adheres to England. Why, you must needs be strangers. Would you be pleased to find a nation of such barbarous temper, that breaking out in hideous violence would not afford you an abode on earth? Whet their detested knives against your throats, spurn you like dogs, and like as if that God owned not, nor made not you, nor that the claimants were not all appropriate to your comforts, but chartered unto them. What would you think to be thus used? This is the stranger's case, and this your mountainish inhumanity.
Yeah, that's a very.
Who does that
very
sound
similar.
like? Who does that sound like? I mean, this is. Can you imagine? I mean, yeah, this is an extraordinary, well-traveled person who wrote this, who knew the world and saw and could identify with being a stranger in different countries and how they were treated.
We have objects enough for those lines, but no one to speak them.
Well said.
Saul, I'm going to change tack for a second. You're on obviously 4 decades of success in film and television, and now you've come back to the theater. You started in the theater, and now you've come back to the theater. for our younger listeners out there, what is it that theater offers that makes you want to come back to it?
That it's not a safe space for either of us is the most extraordinary thing. Is that the audience is French word for audience. One of the French words for audience is assistance. In other words, the audience assists. The audience changes what happens on stage. That doesn't happen paintings, and it doesn't happen anywhere but live performance of any kind. Live performance changes based on the people who are participating. It's about a community together experiencing something together, and they actually change what's happening. There's a truth to the fact that your your best show in your first week on a play is not a tenth as good as your worst show in your last week, because the play grows based on your experience on stage. You're taught by the audience what the thing is about for your community. You're doing it for a specific community. What works for one community doesn't always work for another community, and the thing has to be changed. It's why Don Giovanni in 1993 at the Met, directed by Peter Sellers, was created in a kind of New York street ghetto atmosphere in order to make its relevance, the story relevant to a modern audience. That's why that happens, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And theater is a place where you can really fall asleep at an overpriced seat. And what is important is that when it's not that, when it's more affordable, which is what it should be subsidized by government, not just foundations. I mean, America is one of the few places on earth that its subsidy by government is small, and its subsidy by corporations, is much larger, which leads to its own problems. The subsidy by government also leads to different but no less profound problems. It really needs to be both, but theater needs to be subsidized to the point where it can be afforded. And there are different ways, that happens. Even on Broadway, there's ways to get cheaper seats and ways to see these things. So it's not just for the elite, it's meant, it can actually change lives, live theater. It's why it's so dangerous. It can lead to protest. It can lead to, there's a really interesting thing that happens in Playing Shylock. It's a true story that Mark Learnyoung took from my story. It's actually in a play of mine, and I let him have it, even though it's in my play. I wrote a new play called All in the Telling, and I wrote a book that is an adaptation of my play. It's called All in the Telling, a somewhat true story. The play is called All in the Telling, a somewhat true play. And there's a story in there that you saw, Jim, that my Zeta, my grandfather in Poland in 1936, was horrified that his eldest son, had gone into the theater. And he says it's a sin, it's indecent, and that it's so far from God. He was an Orthodox Jew. And my father says, this is the answer to what I think you're asking, is why people should go to theater. And my father was only 16. What could he say to this? And he said, well, I'm doing this play about a family, troubles between the husband and the wife, and their hopes for the children. And he says, Dad, he says to his father, theater, if it's good, the audience sees themselves on the stage. They laugh, they cry, and for a few minutes, each performance, they don't feel so alone. And his father said, well, then maybe it's not so far from God after all. Now, I've never heard a better definition of art than that my 16-year-old father's definition.
I don't think we could possibly close on a more beautiful note than that. Saul, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I want our listeners to know that you're the author of the new book, All in the Telling, a somewhat true story, which is available November 1st everywhere, books and
On
audio.
Amazon, yeah, yeah. An audiobook too, thank you.
And you're currently starring in Playing Shylock at the Polonsky Shakespeare Center.
Your audiences can go to playingshylock.com to find tickets, and I hope they do, and come up to me afterwards and tell me that you listened to this podcast.
Saul, thank you for joining us. I'm
Okay,
Garrett Vandermeer,
And I'm Jim Elliott.
and thank you for listening to The State of Shakespeare.
Thanks for joining us for the State of Shakespeare podcast. We invite you to visit stateofshakespeare.com for more episodes, information about each of our guests, and the Shakespeare text you heard on the program, and much more. And we welcome you to join the discussion by liking us on Facebook. That's www.stateofshakespeare.com. Thanks for listening.